Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. The restaurant Hamilton's Prime, a chic establishment in downtown New York, shone brightly that evening. The marble-clad walls reflected the golden light of the chandeliers, and an elegant murmur ran through the room where businessmen, celebrities, and wealthy heirs dined. Champagne glasses clinked in a discreet concert of luxury and pride. Among the servers who were working with precision and discretion, Amara Johnson, a young black woman in her 20s, walked forward with a tray laden with gleaming glasses. Her gaze was serious, focused, almost self-effacing. For her, this job was not a career, but a necessity. She dreamed of something else, of a future far from humiliations and condescending customers. At a central table, surrounded by several associates, sat Richard Hamilton, heir to the family that owned the restaurant. An arrogant man, attractive at first glance, but whose self-confidence was only a mask to hide a deep contempt for others. He liked to feel above the world, and especially to remind those he considered inferior of their place. When his gaze fell on Amara, a smirk tugged at his lips. "Look, you there, the waitress." Amara stopped, a little surprised, but politely she approached. "Yes, sir." Richard nodded toward the black piano that sat in the corner of the restaurant, covered with a velvet cover. "Go play us something. Dinner without music is boring, don't you think?" The partners burst out laughing. Amara felt her heart stop. She opened her mouth to reply, but Richard added, in that cold tone that brooked no contradiction. "Don't tell me you don't know. A young woman like you must have some hidden talents. Come on, we want to be entertained." Around them, customers began to turn, drawn to the scene. Laughter rose. Some were already pulling out their phones, convinced that a ridiculous spectacle was about to follow. Amara felt her cheeks flush. Her tray trembled in her hands. Everything inside her screamed that she should refuse, but some invisible force prevented her from speaking. To refuse was to risk her job. To obey was to expose herself to public humiliation. Richard, satisfied with his trap, leaned back comfortably in his chair and crossed his arms, like a king waiting for his jester. "Come on, my dear. Make us dream." Silence fell over the room. All eyes were on her. Breathless, Amara felt a tear threaten to fall, then she took a deep breath. Her step, hesitant at first, slowly led her to the piano. Richard's cruel game had just begun. Richard Hamilton loved two things, power and spectacle. Whenever he was in public, he looked for an opportunity to show that he commanded the room. Tonight, at his favorite restaurant, which bore his name, he reveled in the attention he received from his associates. These men, all dependent on his investments and influence, laughed boisterously at his jokes, nodding their heads at his every remark like courtiers before a king. But what gave Richard the greatest pleasure was not the flattery of his peers, but the fear and embarrassment he caused in those who had no means of defending themselves. And tonight, his gaze had fallen on Amara. She walked toward their table, a tray of glasses perfectly balanced in her slender hands. Her waitress uniform, though simple, highlighted a natural elegance she made no attempt to display. Her hair tied back in a bun revealed a gentle face, but her gaze betrayed a deep fatigue, the fatigue of long workdays and daily humiliation swallowed in silence. Richard beckoned her over, his fingers lazily tapping the immaculate tablecloth. When she stopped in front of him, he made sure to raise his voice so the whole restaurant could hear him. "My dear, we noticed this dinner was a little lacking in entertainment. And since you seem like a resourceful young woman, why not treat us to a little entertainment?" Amara frowned slightly, not understanding where he was going with this. "A show, sir." Richard raised his hand to the piano that sat in the corner, covered in black velvet. "Yes, over there. That piano is decorative, but I'm sure it will sing in your hands. You know how to play, don't you?" A burst of laughter shook the table. One of the partners said ironically, "Oh, this is going to be a real concert, Richard." Amara felt an icy rush of cold flood her stomach. Her lips parted, ready to refuse, but Richard stepped forward, his gaze hardening. Come on, don't be shy. A little music for your customers isn't too much to ask, is it? She took a step back. Her breath caught in her throat. Behind her, she could already hear the murmurs, the amused whispers. Some customers turned their heads, intrigued, others suppressed a cruel smile. Richard, satisfied to see his prey cornered, took his cup of wine and made a toast to cruelty. To improvised culture, gentlemen. To our entertainment this evening. The men burst out laughing again, this time louder. The room fell silent, interrupted only by sniggers. Amara felt her hands tremble, her fingers gripping the tray to keep from dropping it. Every fiber of her body screamed at her to refuse, but another voice rose in her memory, her mother's, gentle but firm. Never let anyone decide your worth. Show them who you are, Amara. She closed her eyes for a second, took a deep breath, then opened them again with a different glow. Her hesitant step turned into a determined march. Without a word, she placed her tray on a nearby table and walked over to the piano. The laughter gradually subsided, replaced by curiosity mixed with impatience. Richard, still convinced he was about to witness a memorable humiliation, crossed his legs and signaled for the impromptu pianist to begin. But in her heart, Amara had already made a decision: she would not be the one to be humiliated tonight. Amara approached the piano, her breath coming out in short bursts. Each step echoed in her mind like a march to the scaffold. Stares weighed on her, some amused, others cruel, all eager to witness her fall. She could still hear the hearty laughter behind her, the mocking murmurs. It's going to be a disaster. She can barely string two notes together. Her heart was beating so loudly she thought the whole room could hear it. She felt as if her legs would buckle under her weight. When she lifted the velvet cover off the piano, her hands were visibly shaking. The shiny black wood of the instrument reflected her worried face. She sat down gently on the stool, placing her trembling fingers on the cold, smooth keys. For a second, she remained frozen, paralyzed by the fear of failure. Shame already burned at her skin. She knew what they were waiting for: dissonant notes, clumsy playing, a pathetic spectacle. Richard wanted to reduce her to a mere distraction, an object of mockery. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes. A tear rolled down her cheek, quickly wiped away with the back of her hand. She thought about her life, about all the times she'd had to endure humiliation without saying anything. About the customers who snapped their fingers to call her back, about the racist remarks disguised as jokes, about the condescending smiles. But most of all, she thought of her mother. That strong woman, who, despite poverty and hardship, had always believed in her talent. She remembered those evenings in the small neighborhood church, where she played a battered old piano, making the air vibrate with imperfect but soulful melodies. Her mother often whispered to her, "Your music is your refuge. When the world is cruel, play. And the world will listen." A warmth rose within her, gradually replacing the fear. Her fingers stopped shaking. The heavy silence of the room suddenly became her ally. She felt everyone holding their breath, ready to judge her, but she was ready to answer them. Richard, sitting in his armchair, a predatory smile on his lips, raised his glass of wine towards his associates. "Look carefully, gentlemen. The comedy is about to begin." Amara lowered her head slightly, her fingers resting delicately on the keys. Time seemed to stand still. Between shame and dignity, between fear and courage, she stood on the edge of a precipice. Then, with a determined gesture, she pressed the first note. A pure sound rose from the piano, clear, deep, vibrant. The note resonated throughout the room like a breath of fresh air, breaking the heavy silence that had preceded it. Amara, her eyes half closed, let her fingers slide over a second key, then a third. Little by little, a soft and captivating melody took shape. At first, the customers didn't know how to react. They expected an awkward noise, a hesitant playing, but not the fluid harmony that filled the air. The first sniggers died away, replaced by an attentive silence. Amara played cautiously, as if rediscovering the piano after years of silence. Her fingers, hesitant at first, began to regain confidence. Each note awakened a memory: evenings spent in her local church, hours stolen after work to practice on a worn keyboard, moments when music had been her only refuge from pain and injustice. His hands moved with more vigor. The melody rose, grew bolder, filling the restaurant with an unexpected warmth. Conversations had fallen silent, cutlery stopped clinking. Everyone, without exception, was now hanging on the notes flowing from the instrument. Even Richard, who had initially raised an amused eyebrow, frowned slightly. He hadn't expected this. What was supposed to be a public humiliation was taking an unexpected turn. Amara, for her part, had closed her eyes. She no longer saw the room, nor the heavy gazes. She no longer heard the laughter, nor the cruel whispers. Only the music existed. Each note was a breath, each chord a release. Her fingers glided with a natural fluidity, as if she had been born for this precise moment. Her fear had transformed into strength, her shame into pride. She felt she was regaining control, not just of this scene, but of a part of herself that had been suppressed. When she opened her eyes for a moment, she saw something that shook her insides. A woman at a nearby table had tears in her eyes. She was no longer an object of ridicule. She was touching souls. The entire room, frozen, held its breath. And at that precise moment, Amara understood that her humiliation was turning into triumph. The entire restaurant seemed to hang on every note. Conversations had evaporated, laughter had died away. All that was heard was the music, vibrant and deep, filling every corner of the room. The customers, who just moments before had been expecting a ridiculous comedy, were now mesmerized. The chords followed one another, sometimes soft and caressing, sometimes powerful and intense. Amara wasn't just playing, she was telling a story. Each note carried a raw emotion, a silent cry, a truth buried too long. Richard, settled in his chair, had lost his smirk. His eyes fixed on Amara with a strange expression, a mixture of surprise and annoyance. This wasn't what he had expected. He wanted laughter, mockery, the satisfaction of seeing a young woman humiliated in front of everyone. But instead, she held the entire room captive, and he, the self-proclaimed master of the game, was losing control. Amazing, a customer whispered in a low voice. She looks like a concert pianist, added another, mouth agape. Even the waiters had stopped, plates still in hand, forgetting their tasks. All eyes were focused on the piano, on Amara, who seemed to be floating above herself. Richard's associates, initially amused, now looked at each other with puzzled expressions. Some had long since stopped laughing and were even beginning to clap softly, carried away in spite of themselves by the beauty of the music. The millionaire felt his pride crack. Every note that echoed through the room was like a silent slap in the face to his cruelty. He wanted to belittle her, but it was he who was losing his stature, he who was becoming insignificant before the unexpected grandeur of his waitress. Amara, however, continued to play without a glance at him. She was no longer the invisible waitress who was ignored or ordered around with a snap of the fingers. She was an artist, a woman who stood out through her talent, through her silent strength. When she paused to change the key, a gasp rippled through the room. The silence was so intense you could have heard a pin drop. Then the notes began again, even more vibrant, even more majestic. That evening, it was no longer Richard Hamilton who entertained the room with his arrogance. It was Amara Johnson, the humiliated waitress who had suddenly become the soul of the restaurant. Every note Amara played seemed to open a door to her past. Her fingers glided with an almost magical fluidity, but behind this mastery hid a story no one in the room suspected. She remembered the small apartment where she grew up, in a poor neighborhood of Brooklyn. Her mother, a night nurse, struggled alone to raise her children. Money was desperately short, but there was always one thing her mother refused to sacrifice: her love of music. Amara saw again the old upright piano sitting in the corner of the neighborhood church. The keys were worn, some slightly warped, but to her, it was a treasure. After school, she would sit at that tired keyboard and spend hours practicing. Her small, childlike hands struck the keys clumsily at first, but little by little, they learned to dance on them. Her first teacher was the church minister, a patient old man who showed her the basics. Then she learned on her own, by listening, imitating, and feeling. Her mother, though harassed by her guards at the hospital, always found a moment to encourage her. She often said to her, "Amara, your music is a light. Even in the darkness, it will always shine." Those words still echoed in her mind as she performed that night, before an audience that saw her for the first time as something other than a simple waitress. But there were also painful memories. The music competition she had entered at the age of 16, convinced she had a chance to shine. She remembered the judges, their cold smiles, the way some had stared at her, as if her place wasn't on a stage but somewhere else, where she belonged. She had played with all her heart, but she hadn't even received a mention. The next day, she had overheard a member of the judges whisper, "Talented, yes, but not the image we are looking for." That day, her dream was shattered. She put away her music, vowing never again to make a fool of herself by thinking her music could change anything. She took on odd jobs, eventually becoming a waitress, relegating her piano to a painful memory. And yet, tonight, forced by Richard's cruelty, she had reopened that part of herself. And her music, instead of betraying her flaws, revealed all her strength. Every note she played was imbued with these memories, poverty, humiliations, but also her mother's love, the echo of timid applause in the church, and the inner conviction that she had always had a value that the world refused to recognize. The customers, though unaware of his story, felt it all. They heard in his music a deep suffering, but also a resilience that moved them. Some closed their eyes, others clasped the hands of their loved ones, touched by an emotion they could not explain. Amara wasn't just playing anymore. She was telling her story. And the entire room listened, hanging on her silent tale. The restaurant Hamilton's Prime, once animated by the clinking of glasses and the hubbub of social conversation, had changed its atmosphere. The room, usually noisy and frivolous, was now bathed in a sacred silence. Every customer, every waiter, every associate of Richard found themselves trapped by Amara's notes, as if they were weaving an invisible net around every heart. The boisterous laughter of a man, who had been amused by the impending humiliation just moments earlier, had died away. He had put down his glass without even realizing it, mesmerized. A woman in a shimmering evening gown had tears in her eyes. A couple who had quarreled at the beginning of dinner had moved closer, their hands clasped again under the influence of this melody that seemed to mend what was broken. The waiters, usually hurried and discreet, had frozen. One of them was still balancing a tray, but his eyes never left Amara. Even the cooks, behind the kitchen window, had approached to observe the scene. Every note transformed into pure emotion. Sweetness, pain, hope. Amara wasn't just playing music. She was unleashing something greater than herself. A universal truth, one that speaks directly to the heart without words. The applause began softly, at first from just one person. An elderly man sitting in a corner stood up, moved, and clapped his hands with rare sincerity. Then a woman followed suit. Soon, the entire restaurant, still filled with music, was applauding in unison, some standing, others still seated, but all sincerely touched. Amara, however, had not stopped playing. Her eyes remained closed, as if she heard nothing but the silent dialogue between herself and her piano. She wasn't looking for applause, she wasn't looking for recognition. She was simply letting herself be guided by an inner force beyond her. At the central table, Richard Hamilton watched, frozen. His associates, who had followed him in his cruel laughter, were now the first to be swept away by emotion. Some even dared to smile and nod their heads in time with the music, betraying their admiration. Richard felt a dull anger rise within him. How could this be? He who had everything, the money, the power, the reputation, was being overshadowed by a mere waitress. He wanted to entertain himself at her expense, and now she was stealing the entire scene. Yet, despite his inner rage, he couldn't deny the truth: she was brilliant. Her fingers danced across the keys with an elegance none of the pianists he'd paid for his social gatherings had ever possessed. It wasn't just technique. It was soul. The entire room had changed. The place where arrogance and superficiality had just become, for a moment, a cathedral of emotion, guided by the music of Amara Johnson. And in this makeshift sanctuary, it was no longer Richard Hamilton who reigned. It was her. Richard Hamilton, who so relished controlling every room he entered, felt for the first time relegated to the background. He, the man accustomed to being the center of attention, saw his partners, his clients, and even his own staff turn their backs on his authority to devote themselves to her, to Amara. Sitting in his velvet armchair, he gripped the armrests, his fingers clenching until his knuckles turned white. His arrogant smile, which usually created illusions, had faded. In its place, a shadow of doubt, almost vulnerability, distorted his features. Every note Amara struck was a silent insult to his pride. She didn't need words to reduce him. She didn't need to defend herself. It was he who, through his own cruelty, had triggered this moment. And it was he who was paying the price. His associates, who until then had laughed loudly at every one of his jokes, had changed sides without hesitation. One of them, Gregory, leaned towards another and whispered, without caring if he was overheard. "It's amazing, she plays better than any musician Richard has ever hired." "She looks like a professional," replied the other, fascinated. Richard felt an unpleasant heat rise in the back of his neck. His authority, his image as a superior man, was crumbling before his eyes, before the eyes of those who usually flattered him. He wanted to intervene, to say something to break the magic, but no words came out. For even he, despite his rage, could not deny the beauty of what he heard. His eyes remained fixed on Amara, and a part of him, the part he hated the most, felt admiration. But he refused to give in. In his mind, only one word echoed, control. He had to take back control. He couldn't let a simple black waitress, whom he had chosen to humiliate him, outshine him in front of everyone. He leaned towards the table, trying to create a diversion. "It's okay. Nothing special," he said in a low voice, as if to reassure himself. But no one was listening. His associates had their eyes fixed on the piano, unaffected by his venom. This indifference was a greater wound for Richard than the music itself. For the first time, he understood that his power, so evident a few minutes earlier, could dissolve in an instant. Amara, however, didn't even look at him. She wasn't playing for him, or for anyone else. She was playing for herself, for her mother, for that little girl who had never stopped dreaming behind a worn-out piano. And it was this indifference that destroyed Richard even more than the beauty of the music. He no longer existed in her world. The millionaire, so sure of himself, so arrogant, was nothing more than a helpless spectator, drowned in the unexpected triumph of a woman he wanted to crush. Amara felt her fingers run over the keys as if guided by a force greater than herself. Each note was a silent response to the humiliation Richard had sought to inflict on her. She didn't need words, no need for noisy revolt. Her dignity spoke for her, and her music carried that voice with a power that nothing and no one could stifle. In her mind, it was as if she were confronting Richard directly. She remembered his cruel smile, his condescending tone, his certainty that he could use her like a toy. But the more she played, the more her heart filled with new energy. She was taking back what he had stolen from her, her pride. The room, completely captivated, vibrated with her. The looks that had initially fallen on her with mockery now shone with admiration. The laughter had disappeared, replaced by serious, moved faces. Some customers' eyes were misty with tears, others nodded gently, carried away by the power of the melody. Richard, however, remained frozen. His throat was dry, his wine glass untouched in front of him. Every second Amara continued to play reinforced his humiliation. She, the waitress he'd forced to make a fool of herself, stood there, turning his trap into a triumph. She was no longer his victim. She was his silent tormentor. A final, powerful chord rang out, echoing off the marble walls like an explosion. Amara lingered on the last note, letting it vibrate until silence returned. Then she raised her head. Her gaze, proud and determined, swept across the entire room. She didn't look for Richard. She didn't need to confront him directly. She knew he had lost. The restaurant erupted in applause, this time hearty and frank. Some customers stood up, others shouted his name after hearing it whispered by the waiters. Phones filmed the scene, immortalizing this moment of unexpected glory. Amara rose slowly from the stool, her heart still beating fast but filled with a strange serenity. She bowed her head slightly in thanks, then, without seeking glory, calmly returned to pick up her tray from the neighboring table. She had played. She had responded. She had won. And without saying a single word, Amara Johnson had just given the world a lesson that Richard Hamilton would never forget. Dignity is not trampled on. It always rises again. As the last note faded into the thick air of the restaurant, a collective gasp rippled through the room. The applause, hesitant at first, turned into a thunderous ovation. Customers rose one after another, clapping their hands, some standing on chairs, others shouting cheers. Amara, slightly out of breath, sat for a moment, looking at the piano as if she had just gone through something beyond her control. Her fingers were still trembling slightly, but in her eyes shone a new flame, the certainty that she had just marked this moment, and this place, forever. Murmurs of respect ran through the room. She is amazing. I've never heard anyone play like that. Even the waiters, usually hurried and invisible, approached to congratulate her, some with eyes shining with emotion. The cooks, usually cloistered behind their kitchen doors, were now applauding, amazed by the strength and mastery they had just witnessed. And then, as if from a dream, an elegant and influential woman, seated at a corner table, walked towards Amara. Her face expressed a mixture of admiration and urgency. "My name is Victoria Lane, a music producer in Manhattan," she said, her voice vibrating with emotion. "You have a rare talent. I would like to discuss a project with you, immediately." Amara felt her heart race. This was the opportunity she had long awaited but never dared to hope for. Everything she had experienced, all the humiliation, all the pain, suddenly became a springboard to her dream. Richard, for his part, watched the scene with suppressed anger and a mixture of shame and shock. His plan had completely failed. The waitress he wanted to humiliate had not only outdone him, but had transformed a situation of contempt into a resounding triumph. Amara picked up her tray and calmly walked towards the other tables, smiling but humble, aware that tonight she had not only conquered the room, but also a part of its destiny. For the first time, she felt free. Free to dream, free to create, free to show the world that her worth did not depend on the cruel judgments of one man. That evening, in the luxurious restaurant where she had been humiliated, Amara Johnson was consecrated not only as a pianist, but as a woman capable of transforming adversity into power, and contempt into glory. Richard Hamilton remained frozen in his chair, helpless. Everything he had thought he controlled, the restaurant, the attention, his authority, had collapsed in a matter of minutes. The mocking laughter and condescending looks that usually accompanied his entrances had been replaced by applause for Amara. Her associates, also stunned, approached the young woman to congratulate her, completely oblivious to Richard's presence. Even some customers, who moments earlier would have laughed alongside her, were now on his side. The arrogance and power he had used to humiliate were turning against him. Amara, however, had regained her composure. She didn't stoop to looking at him. She had already won her revenge, and it had nothing to do with money or prestige. She approached the piano one last time, touched the keys with a discreet smile, and picked up her tray, ready to return to her work, but forever changed. Victoria Lane, the influential producer, had already approached her and gently talked her into a musical project. Tonight, Amara had not only won over the room, but had opened a door to a future she had long since stopped dreaming of. Richard, humiliated, felt a dull anger rise within him. He had wanted to crush her pride, expose her to ridicule, but it was he who found himself ridiculed. The waitress he believed to be weak had just proven to him that his cruelty could never surpass talent and dignity. And that was when Richard realized, too late, true power doesn't come from money, authority, or arrogance. It comes from courage, talent, and the ability to remain true to oneself in the face of injustice. The entire restaurant continued to applaud. Customers were filming, some already posting the videos on social media. Amara no longer saw judgmental stares before her, but eyes full of admiration and respect. Her silent triumph had made more noise than any mockery Richard could have imagined. The millionaire was left powerless, alone with his frustration. The waitress he had tried to humiliate had just turned the situation into a resounding victory. That evening, power had changed sides. Amara Johnson, the humble and talented young woman, had just shown the world that dignity, artistry, and courage are far more powerful weapons than money and arrogance. And in that luxurious room, where she had been forced to expose herself, she had finally found recognition and freedom.